Good evening and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for Getting Off the Emotional Roller Coaster, Strategies to Balance Mood and Hormones, presented by Chantal Dumas, ND. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. There will also be a question and answer session at the end of the presentation, time permitting. If you would like to ask questions, you can do so throughout the presentation by typing into the question box in the control panel at the right side of your screen. Please note this presentation is being recorded for future distribution. We are now ready to begin, so without further ado, I will turn it over to Chantal. Welcome, Chantal, and thanks for joining us today.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for attending this webinar. I'm very excited to share all my knowledge regarding hormones and the connection with the moon tonight. And the reason I wanted to talk about this topic is because over my past 21 years of practice, one of the questions I certainly hear the most is, am I going crazy? Or I feel like I'm going crazy. And it is not what's happening. It's really, you'll see as we go through the hormonal challenges and imbalances, how they affect our moods. So we'll start with the moods and then I'll bring you into the hormones, and throughout the presentation, we'll have also a quick overview of our new test called Myblueprint, which evaluates for 84 different SNPs, and I'll get into more details about that, but I'll give you concrete examples throughout the presentation to how this would apply to mood and anxiety disorders. So let's start with some statistics. So depression is the leading cause of disability worldwide, and according to the World Health Organization, there's about 121 million people affected by depression. In 2013, there was an estimated 3 million Canadians, which is almost 12%, age 18 years and older, that reported having mood and or anxiety disorders. 23% of these people did not consult a health professional in the past 12 months, although 93% are actually taking prescription medication to manage their symptoms. And what is very deceiving about this is that very few people with a diagnostic are actually engaging in self-management strategies such as physical exercise or developing some kind of protocol to address their symptoms. And as we know, females have a much higher rate, almost twice as much mood disorders and generalized anxiety than their male counterparts. Okay, so depression. Depression is also called major depressive disorder. There's a whole spectrum of intensity of the symptoms, and they can also vary through the month or through the different depression episodes that one may encounter through their life. So depression is a very common and serious illness that impacts negatively how we feel, the way we think, and how we act. So we have to be careful. Like sometimes we'll say, oh, I'm so depressive before my periods. Like we can go through little episodes, but to really be considered a clinical depression, the symptoms have to interfere with your ability to function, whether at work or at home. And real clinical depression is diagnosed in 1 in 6 people in the overall population at some point in our life. But 1 in 3 women will experience a major depressive episodes in their lifetime. And again, these are the statistics, so those who actually seek help and diagnostic for their symptoms. So here are some of the very common symptoms. I'm not going to go through all of them, but just so that we are conscious that some of the symptoms of depression can affect us not only emotionally, but also physically. So a lot of the symptoms that can be experienced physically. Okay, something appearing here. Okay. So now the flip side of depression, general anxiety disorders, you'll see that very commonly people may experience both ends of the spectrum. So among the symptoms of generalized anxiety, we'll have like the same thing, symptoms that will affect our moods, but that will also affect us physically, like we can have sweating, nausea, diarrhea, very common connection between digestive issues and mood disorders, as we will see. So sometimes people read the symptoms and they tell me, I think I have symptoms of both depression and anxiety. So which one is it? Or can it be both? Well, actually, depression can be triggered by an anxiety disorder. More or less half of the people with depression also suffer from anxiety, and anxiety can be a symptom of depression. So really, it's mood disorders in a big chapter that we can put all of it together. So how do we get to have mood disorders? What's the etiology of mood disorders? We don't know for sure. We don't have like one specific answer to that. So we say it's a result of a complex interaction between genetic, so our predispositions, biological, developmental, and other socioeconomic factors, and work stress, or all forms of stress actually play a very, very important role in mood disorders, as we will see. So there's also all this talk around neurotransmitters, and we often incriminate serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, which is another name for adrenaline and noradrenaline. We'll talk about epinephrine and norepinephrine, they're synonyms. So, but we'll see that it's a little bit more complex than just addressing the neurotransmitters. So among the risk factors, as we saw, being woman is a predisposition because of all the hormonal cycles. Other diseases such as all the digestive issues, thyroid issues could also be linked to depression or anxiety. Addictions, so addictions may be a risk factor. They could also be a consequence of the mood disorders. Trauma, especially childhood trauma, various stress, and the genetic predisposition. So I would like to introduce you this Myblueprint Test, which AOR came up with in the month of May, so it's fairly new. And this is a very, very interesting test, very affordable, non-invasive. You can do that at home. It's a simple mouth swab. You can order the test online or through your physician, and we will send you beautifully illustrated result that you can either export as a PDF file or interact with on your computer. So this test will check for 84 SNPs, which are single nucleotide polymorphisms. So basically small variants or variation on genes, and what they do is they affect the way your genes may, for example, transform certain vitamins or detoxify hormones or detoxify neurotransmitters. So they are very, very pertaining to our clinical practice. So 50 genes are tested in that test, and we separate them in 8 different categories, including mental wellness and hormonal health. So very, very concrete pertaining information again. So the report, if you were to print it, would look something like this. It is about 50 pages in length, very, very detailed, very descriptive. So you have a lot of recommendation. Of course, the test talks about your predisposition, your sensitivity to certain environmental factors. It does not diagnose anything, so it will sometimes refer you to your physician for further testing, or it will provide some recommendation, but it's very, very detailed, and it's very user-friendly as well. So as I said, you can either print it or interact with it online. So the way I like to approach every type of health disorder, health imbalance as a naturopathic doctor is obviously looking at the diet. So I like to build the protocol from the bottom up, starting with the diet. Oftentimes people are looking for a quick fix because they come to us and they've tried different things, or they may have seen different practitioners and they want to have bioidentical hormones, or they want to have something that's going to balance their mood. They just want to have one targeted product or one magic pill, as I like to call them. And you'll see that it's a little bit more complex and comprehensive than that. So in the diet, what do we want? Obviously, an abundance of fresh fruits and vegetables. It's good not only for your moods and your hormones, but it's a preventative factor for more chronic diseases. And what we want in the fruits and veggies are mostly the phytochemicals that act as antioxidants. So they protect our cells, they protect our organs, they protect our nervous system. And also we like the fibers in the fruits and vegetables. So that's like a big component of a healthy diet. Then we want to look for omega-3 fatty acids, which can come from vegetal or animal source, and we'll see that the test can give us information about that. We want sources of vitamin D. Vitamin D, very, very important for the mood. We know about vitamin D in terms of its role in the musculoskeletal system, but vitamin D is very important for our immune system and also for our moods. There are several clinical studies that have looked into that. There's a big meta-analysis that came out in 2013 that looked into different studies that were performed with a participation of like over 31,000 patients, and they saw a clear association between lower levels of vitamin D and clinical depression. So it's another factor. We want to make sure that not only we get proper sun exposure, but that we consume food items that are rich in vitamin D. Then vitamin B complex, we'll find those mostly in complex cereals, so whole cereals. We want to make sure that we have protein, either breakfast or lunch, depending if we are fasting in the morning. It's very trendy right now, but we want to make sure that we have a protein source, a quality protein source early on during the day. In my clinical experience, most women don't even eat half of the protein they need to eat during the day. So we want to look at grossly 1 gram of protein per kilo of weight. So it would be somewhere between 50 and 75 grams of protein for the average woman. And I would say many women eat less than 30 grams a day. And why is that so important? Well, because the neurotransmitters such as serotonin and Gaba in our brain are made out of amino acids, which come from protein. So having enough protein in our diet is very, very important. Then we want to make sure that we go low on the sugar and simple carbohydrates, because those have an impact on, again, our mood stability. So we want to make sure we keep our carb intake fairly low. And we want to be also careful with caffeine, because it kinds of whip our adrenal glands, and we'll see the importance of the adrenal glands. And we want to make sure that we consume a lot of water, because even mild dehydration will affect our mood. So very important factor as well. So there are different things we can find in the diet with the blueprint testing, but pertaining to moods, I think the most important ones are omega-3s and vitamin D. And the omega-3, it would, for example, give us the information in terms of our ability to convert dietary fat into EPA, DHA, so our ability to use vegetable oil and transfer them, as opposed to having to take omega-3s that come from fish oil or algal oil. So that's a very good information to have, especially if you're a vegetarian and try to avoid the fish oil. Well, if you have a predisposition in having a difficulty converting, you might have to consider taking an animal source of omega-3. Vitamin D, well, the same thing. We are looking at 5 different SNPs or 5 different variations that can affect the way you use your vitamin D, use your vitamin D in your body. So you might want to consider taking a vitamin D supplement on top of vitamin D in your diet and sun exposure. In the diet, we also want to make sure that we look into food sensitivities and neurotoxins. So good examples of that are the exomorphins that come from gluten and casein. So certain people lack a specific enzyme called DPP4 enzyme. And when you do not have that enzyme, you do not degrade or transform the gluten and the casein efficiently. And the resulting protein that you have can attach themselves to morphine receptors and will induce certain mood changes. So that's something you might want to test out just by simply removing all wheat and other cereals that contain gluten and dairies from your diet and see how that affects your mood. neurotoxins such as aspartame, monosodium glutamate, artificial dyes, especially red dye number 5, can have an impact also in the way our brain processes information and reacts. So it's another thing we might want to make sure to avoid in our diet. In terms of the tests, we have different SNPs that can be involved in gluten intolerance and in lactose intolerance. Now, it's important to understand that because you are predisposed to having gluten doesn't mean you are gluten intolerant and doesn't mean you have celiac disease. You have to perform other tests to evaluate that. And it does not mean that you do not degrade the gluten properly and have that gluteomorphine as a result. But if you do have the gluten sensitivity genes predisposition or the lactose, and I think it's an extra motivation, and it's a good piece of information to have, because you might want to reduce or completely eliminate those sources in your diet, not only for the way it affects your mood, but the way it affects your digestive systems, because as I was mentioning, there's very, very strong ties and connections between gut inflammation, gut health, and moods. So this is, in my opinion, a very good factor that we can look for in the Myblueprint test. Then after the diet, we want to look into exercise. This has received a lot of publicity. We know that exercise compares favorably to antidepressant medications as a first-line treatment for mild to moderate depression. It doesn't mean it has to be either or. It's also a good adjunct to medication. So even if people are being medicated for their depression, it's always a good idea to incorporate physical activity, depression or anxiety. And it's good because it produces the endorphins. It's good because it shifts our mind from our negative or pattern-oriented thoughts. And it also improves our self-confidence. And people are under the impression sometimes that they have to exercise a whole lot, but we see positive results with as little as 30 minutes a day for 3 to 5 times a week. So it's not a whole lot, but it can actually really, really improve the mind, especially if you combine physical exercise with a healthier diet, eliminate some of that gluten, lactose, and other exotoxins. In the blueprint, we can look for different things, very interesting panel on everything to do with physical exercise. We can look for exercise motivation, endurance versus power, risk of injury, exercise recovery. Very interesting SNPs, for example, in the exercise recovery, telling us about how the body is managing inflammation. Again, the tolerance to pain is also very interesting. So this is very empowering to have this type of information, because it also helps us choose the best type of exercise for our body, and maybe use more anti-inflammatory substances such as curcumin or antioxidants, both from the diets and as supplements, if we know that we're more prone to produce more antioxidants when we exercise. So I think this is really, really interesting to have. If we dive into the neurotransmitters per se, to make this matter very simple, let's just say that neurotransmitters and hormones as well, they're simply chemical messengers, and they travel from one neuron to the next through the synaptic cleft, so that's the space between the two neurons, and what they do is they induce a reaction in the next neuron. And the enzymes that are in charge of degrading those neurotransmitters, the main ones are catechol O-methyltransferase, which we call COMT for short, and monoamine oxidase, or MAO. So you may have heard of those because they have become increasingly popular since we're talking a lot about epigenetics and how to modulate our gene response to our environment through diet and different nutritional supplements. So what basically those enzymes do is they will control the rate at which we will degrade neurotransmitters such as serotonin or adrenaline. So obviously, if you're not good at degrading the hormones, or the neurotransmitters, it might have positive or negative impacts, but we can modulate that through diets and certain supplements. And again, knowledge is everything. So we are testing for those two very important enzymes in the blueprint. And so a recommendation would look like this. If you have the genetic variant, for example, on the COMT, the action plan would recommend you to enhance the COMT activity with foods that are high in magnesium. Magnesium acts as a cofactor to support this enzyme's activity, and to maybe incorporate magnesium supplements in the form of glycinate or malate. And you would want, of course, avoid to further inhibit the activity of the COMT enzyme by avoiding excess stress or supplements which contain quercetin and excess stimulants such as caffeine. So it's very, very concrete pertaining information that you would obtain through the blueprint testing. So the serotonin, or we often call it the happy hormone, the serotonin is very important in terms of depression and anxiety because it's an important calming neurotransmitter. It has a wide variety of functions. It affects our emotions, obviously, but also our appetite, digestion, sense of pain, sexual desire and function. And it's also a precursor to melatonin. So the neurotransmitter that affects our sleep quality and our wake-sleep cycle. So serotonin is very, very important. And here are some of the signs of low serotonin. One of the signs that I think is very obvious for me is when people tell me they do not tolerate the lack of light, like the days where it's very dark, and the high appetite for carbs. There are often signs that will make me think that the person might be low in serotonin. The problem with serotonin, we cannot give a serotonin supplement because it does not cross the blood-brain barrier. So we have to give the body precursor, and then the body will make its own serotonin. So here is the serotonin pathway, which is, again, very important because it affects not only how we feel, but also how we sleep. And what I want you to notice is that we start with the proteins. Here is one of the reasons why having enough protein in the diet is such a key important factor. Sometimes people look for all types of supplements, but neglect the basis, which is having enough protein. Then those proteins, we want to make sure that we can utilize them properly, and for that we need the gastric acid. So on the right side you have the gastric acid, and you have the enzymes that are involved in transforming protein into an amino acid called L-tryptophan. L-tryptophan becomes 5-hydroxytryptophan or 5-HTP, which then becomes serotonin and ends up into melatonin. And on the left side you have the cofactors that work to activate those enzymes. And you see that the B vitamins are very important, especially B6, and that magnesium is the key mineral. Zinc is also very important in the process. So unless we have those basic elements, the proteins, the vitamins, the minerals, and the gastric acid to utilize all that, we will have a hard time making serotonin. Now, this is a problem because you saw that a very big majority of people with depression are being medicated, and a lot of times they are prescribed what are called SSRIs, or medication that will work on the recapturing of the serotonin. But imagine if you're not making enough serotonin to start with because you're having issues with one of these elements, then what are you going to recapture? So that's why not everybody has the same response to those SSRIs medication. And that's why we also want to start with the basic. So start with the protein, make sure the person has the cofactors, so the B vitamins and the magnesium. And 5-HTP does exist as a supplement, but again, if you notice, you need the B vitamin and the magnesium to convert that 5-HTP into serotonin and melatonin. So oftentimes people tell me, I've tried 5-HTP, it doesn't work for me, and it's only because they're not taking the cofactors. It might also be a matter of dosage because, you know, as you'll see, it comes in 2 different dosage. So if people have a hard time having enough protein in their diet, I like to recommend Advanced Whey. So it's a very high quality protein supplement. You have 22 grams of protein per scoop or per serving, and it's very low in sugar, 1.4 gram of sugar, low in fat as well. And if you want to make it more keto oriented, then you can always add some of the good fats in your smoothie. Very easy to mix, very good tasting. And what is also very unique about our Advanced Whey is the amount of lactoferrin that it has in it. Lactoferrin is very important in supporting our immune system. And like I mentioned several times already, the connection between the gut, inflammation in the gut, and what's happening in the mood. So lactoferrin might be a very interesting element. And also the alpha-lactalbumin, because of the transformation mechanism that we use, we are able to spare the high amount of alpha-lactalbumin, and that's a good source of tryptophan. As you saw, tryptophan is a precursor to serotonin, our feel-good hormone or neurotransmitter. So that's all very good. And, you know, people can make a smoothie if they're rushed in the morning, or, you know, if they're not too hungry, they don't want to make a big breakfast, well, they can still have that good quality protein and take it on the go. They can sip on it on their way to work. I also like to put other supplements that people take. I make them open the capsules and add them to that smoothie. So as you saw, the B vitamins are very, very important for the neurotransmitters production, but also for overall health of our nervous system. And as you can see, vitamin Bs are involved in several pathways and functions in the body. So they're also very common deficiencies. Many people are deficient in vitamin Bs because they're not necessarily eating those whole wheat, or because they're gluten-free or whole cereals, and Bs are needed to produce the neurotransmitters. So the more stress we go through, the more B vitamins we need. Bs are also needed to use sugar. We know that in Canada, people use about 75 kilos of sugar per year. So that's crazy amount of sugar. You need a lot of B vitamins to process all that. So that's several reasons. And also to detoxify, we need the B vitamins. So many people are deficient in the B vitamins. And our B complex, advanced B complex and advanced B complex Ultra are definitely the best option out there, because they are the active coenzyme forms. Among those SNPs, or those variations on our genes, some affect the way we transform vitamin B6, folates, vitamin B12, and they are more efficient in that way. So that's why it's important to take them in their active form for all the people who don't know that might have those limitations in the utilization of their vitamins coming from their diet. So we have them in the active form. We also have balanced ratios, so it's not the 25 or the 50. We have them in scientifically established ratios. So we have the regular advanced B complex, which comes in capsule form, and we have the more advanced or the newer version, which is the advanced B complex Ultra. And that one comes in tablet form, and it has like 3 different forms of vitamin B12 in it. It's a formula that is a little bit more advanced, and for those who prefer to take less pills during the day. So 5-HTP comes from a herb called Griffonia simplicifolia. It comes from Ghana mostly, and the seeds of that shrub contains the 5-HTP, which we could also have from protein, but we have it here in a more concentrated format. And 5-HTP is good because it's well absorbed orally. Above 70% of it gets through the blood-brain barrier and is able to convert into the serotonin. So there's a lot of clinical trials that have been performed on 5-HTP. And we've looked at least 19 different ones, and we saw that 50% of patients saw improvement of their depression symptoms after 3 days, and 80% within 2 weeks. Now, as you know, conventional antidepressants reach their maximal effect between 4 to 6 weeks. So that's very, very quick acting. And again, it would perform even better if you combine that with the B vitamins. So the 5-HTP comes in the regular dosage, which is 50 milligram, and the 5-HTP extra strength, which is double the dose, 400 milligram. Then in the neurotransmitters, we have GABA. So GABA is the principal inhibitory or calming neurotransmitter. So we often think of serotonin as being the most important, but the most abundant is definitely GABA. So GABA, what it does is basically it increases the alpha waves, which provides relaxation, and decreases the beta waves, which are associated with anxiety. GABA also comes from protein. It comes from glutamine, which becomes glutamate. And glutamate, when it has the cofactor presence, which are B6 and magnesium, becomes GABA. Glutamate has a bad name because we think of it as an excitatory neurotransmitter, but it's also a necessary one because it is associated with our brain energy, our learning ability, and so on and so forth. But the idea is to not have it in excess. It has to be well balanced with the calming neurotransmitter, which is GABA. But for that, we need to have the cofactor. So here are some of the signs of low GABA or GABA deficiency. And the factors that affect the GABA level are definitely chronic stress, dysglycemia, so we're back to not eating too much sugar, and gut microbiome dysbiosis. So gut microbiome, you'll see, is also very, very important in balancing our moods. So what we want to do to increase GABA, improve sleep, manage inflammation in our body. A lot of people live with low-grade inflammation, decrease the stress, incorporate exercise, and again, address the microbiome. Some of the foods that increase GABA, as you see, all the good fermented food that are so trendy right now, but that are also very, very good for our microbiome or our gut bacteria. As you see, GABA needs absolutely B6 and magnesium as cofactors. It needs zinc as well in terms of the binding to the neurotransmitters, and probiotic will modulate the whole transformation from glutamine to glutamate and then to GABA. So very important to have those cofactor presence. And the beauty of it is both vitamin B6, magnesium, and zinc are necessary cofactors for GABA and also for serotonin, so they are the same ones. So the cofactors, you could take them again with the magnesium supplement or the B vitamins, but I really like the magnesium synergy. So it's our magnesium formula. It's a powder form, and it contains a whole array of vitamins and cofactors. So obviously it has the magnesium, it has the taurine, which is also very important in how we use the magnesium. It has the zinc, it has the vitamin B6. So it's really a whole formula. We can take it, for example, in hot water in the evening and have the calming effect of the magnesium and glycine and taurine, or we can use it as a sports supplement in our water bottle. That's also another very good way to use it. So here is the detailed information about this supplement, and I've highlighted the ones that are more pertaining to the moon and hormonal balance. Okay, so the microbiome. So we could do a whole presentation just on the relationship between the gut and the moods, and that's also a topic that's increasingly popular. But the microbiome is capable of producing and delivering neurologically active substances. So 90% of the serotonin is actually synthesized and stuck in the gut. And so we see that depression is closely linked to gut inflammation, and glutamine and glutamic acid, as we saw, depends on also the conversion through the gut microbiome. And there's clear association in clinical studies between diminished level of lactobacillus and bifidobacterium and diminished level of GABA. So very important, again, to address any kind of underlying gut inflammation or gut issue if we want to be able to balance the neurotransmitters. And because it's all very closely linked together, there's a crosstalk that's happening, and the inflammation, the serotonin, and the depression have to be addressed as one big factor. So again, we could have a whole talk just on that, but I only picked a few products in the AOR line that could be interesting for the microbiome, IBD relief. We have two very great probiotics, Probiotic 3 and Advanced Biotics, L-glutamine powder, and the Solufiber. Solufiber, very important in terms of also recuperating the hormones that we're trying to detoxify, and you'll see when we get to the hormone section. L-theanine is also a very interesting supplement that we could provide. Sometimes I go for L-theanine if I have younger children, elderlies, if I'm not clear into are we having more anxiety or more depression. Theanine is sort of the balancing, does all neurotransmitter. So it comes from green tea. It acts a little bit like glutamate, so it antagonizes the action of glutamate, which is the excitatory neurotransmitter. So it has a direct effect on serotonin production, Gaba production. It increases those nice alpha waves that we like, but it doesn't induce drowsiness because 5-HTP might have that effect in certain people. Well, you know, if you have to drive your car to work or if you're going to school, you might want to be relaxed but not feel drowsy. In that case, 5-HTP is very, very excellent. And we have a newcomer, saffron. Saffron has been studied quite extensively, actually. I found a few systematic review of different clinical studies, and it compares very advantageously with conventional antidepressants medication. It has a similar efficacy, and saffron works on the serotonin pathways, basically, but a little bit like curcuma, it has a wide variety of actions, and that's because, you know, herbs have a lot of active molecules. They're not one single molecule. So saffron is also antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, neuroendocrine, and neuroprotective. So it protects our whole nervous system. So it's also a very nice addition to the different products for the moods we already had in the AOR line. So the one we have is 2% safranal, which is the main active ingredient. It's handpicked and standardized at 2% safranal, so you know that you have the good product. Saffron is a very expensive spice, so there's a lot of fake out there. It's important to use a brand you can trust. So how do we connect hormones and neurotransmitters? Well, progesterone, estrogens, and testosterone, so our main steroid hormones, act very, very closely with our nervous system. So there's a lot of crosstalk again happening between our glands and our nervous system. So it works through a bunch of negative feedback loops. So basically when there's enough of a hormone or hormonal fluctuation, it will tell our brains to do more or do less, and that can have an effect on the mood, and some people are more sensitive than others to that crosstalk. And as you see here, you have on the left side, like the brain during the menstrual cycle. We know that the first part of the menstrual cycle is dominated by estrogens, and then we ovulate around day 14, and then the second part is dominated normally by progesterone. So you see that in the first part of the cycle, when estrogen is more dominant, you can have better spatial skills and you're more social, but you can also be more anxious. Now, progesterone is very closely linked to GABA production. So the second phase of your cycle, you can feel calmer, you can have better sleep. So it all depends, and it can change again from 1 month to the next, but it's just very important to be conscious of those interactions. Remember at the beginning, I told you about the sentence that I hear the most, which is, I think I'm going crazy. Well, this is why you think you're going crazy, because we're very familiar with the hormonal variation of a pregnant woman. So what you have on the first peak is the hormonal variation, the amplitude of the variation during pregnancy. But what we don't talk so much about is that during perimenopause, which is this very long period that can go from basically your early 30s until you hit menopause. So it's 15 to 20 years in certain cases. And the amplitude of the variation during perimenopause is even bigger than during pregnancy. So that's why you're feeling all these different changes in the body and in the mood. So it's because of all these huge hormonal variation. And during that period, that perimenopause period, women are 14 times more likely to experience depression. 14 times. So very close link. So again, wanting to just address one neurotransmitter might be missing the whole picture. So all these symptoms that we experience during perimenopause, again, can be physical, but very related to the mood. And here on the left side is what I like to call the Bermuda Triangle, because it is where a lot of women feel that they're being engulfed, is between the nervous systems, the immune system, and the endocrine system. And as you see, neurotransmitters and hormones have this crosstalk between those three systems. And that's why it's very, very important to address the whole picture and not try to just take that one supplement or that one prescription medication, because we're a system, we work together. We have to look at the holistic picture of all of it. So again, progesterone mainly acts on Gaba receptor. Estrogens will influence the serotonin activity, and testosterone goes into the dopamine, but we'll keep that for a different talk. We'll focus mostly on estrogen and progesterone. So here are some of the symptoms of low estrogens. We all know them because we hear a lot about it going towards menopause. And it's very sad because many women are actually being prescribed antidepressant medication, and a lot of times it's just because they've not done enough investigations into looking into the hormonal aspect of it all. So we're very familiar with the low estrogen and estrogen replacement, but not so much with progesterone, although this is greatly improving. But progesterone has a lot of impact on our body, and it's actually there to balance the effect of estrogens. And as you can see, a low progesterone can be linked to depression and anxiety. So not so good. So in the hormonal variation, again, picture, yes, for sure, the estrogen goes down as we age and as we go towards menopause, like we've all been told. And yes, there is that 35% drop, but as you see, the drop is fairly smooth, and it's really happening more intensively once we pass our 50 or once we reach menopause. But look at the progesterone drop. The progesterone drops is as steep as 75%, and it starts a lot younger, because as soon as we are skipping ovulation certain months, we don't have that corpus luteum to create the progesterone in our body, so we need to rely on adrenal glands to produce all the progesterone. And so as you see, when we have that gap between the progesterone and the estrogen, we are in this state of estrogen dominance, which is very, very common. So we used to see, I've been in practice for 21 years. So at the beginning of my practice, I used to see a lot of women who were lacking estrogen. But nowadays, what we see a lot more often is this scenario right here, where estrogen might be at a normal or low end level, and progesterone is the one that is really, really lacking. So a lot of symptoms associated with estrogen dominance, basically all the hormonal complaints come from this state of estrogen dominance. And again, we have to be conscious of how it balances out with progesterone. So what do we do about this? Well, we have to optimize liver function. Two main pathways manage the estrogens in our body and all hormones in our body: the methylation pathway and the sulfation pathway. Methylation is dependent on three main vitamins: B6, B12, and folic acid. And as you see, the B vitamin and the magnesium are needed on both sides. So it's kind of very neat, because the same vitamins and minerals we need to create our neurotransmitters, we need them to detoxify our hormones in our liver. So we're really having a common conversation here. So the methylation, again, is a topic I could go on and on about, but it's basically how our body is adding a methyl group between molecules and changing their structure and function. And that process is very basic to human life. Like, we really need the methylation to function optimally, because one of the things it does is it acts like switches and turns genes on or off. So we really want the methylation to function optimally, and some of the functions involve the synthesis of neurotransmitters, detoxification, and hormone clearance. So methylation has to be optimal. Certain SNPs, again, can affect the methylation pathways, and we look for 4 of them in the Myblueprint test. And again, it would be by incorporating the bioactive form of B vitamins that we could bypass those SNPs that we might be affected with. EstroAdapt is a very interesting product to detoxify the excess estrogens. The main ingredient that has been documented in there is DIM, but they all have important roles, and that will be the topic of another presentation where I will really focus on detoxifying estrogens, because it's really important to a lot of women, and it's been a passion of mine for a long time. So EstroAdapt is a good idea, but again, making sure that we're working on a gut that is healthy, that is not hyperpermeable, because then we're just recycling this excess estrogen. The Hpa Axis is basically the system that reacts in our body when we're exposed to stress. So when there's enough cortisol release. Cortisol is released just like adrenaline when we're undergoing stress, and the adrenal react by producing the cortisol when we're exposed to stress. When there's enough cortisol produced, normally the adrenals stop producing the cortisol. But when we live in a state of chronic stress, what happens is our brain gets desensitized to that excess cortisol, and instead of having this shutting down reaction, it keeps producing the cortisol, and then we have a chronically elevated level of cortisol, which is linked to a whole array of problems as well. So addressing the stress is very important in trying to balance moods and hormone. It's also important because remember, when the hormones go down, the adrenal glands have to take over and produce some of our steroid hormones. Before menopause, the adrenal glands produce about 35% of our hormones, but after menopause, it's over 50% of our hormones. And what happens is when we produce this cortisol in excess, we're using the progesterone as raw material to produce that cortisol, and we end up lacking progesterone, therefore adding to that imbalance between estrogen and progesterone. Again, in our Myblueprint test, the level of COMT activity, remember when we saw it at the beginning, I told you that it acts in degrading the neurotransmitters, but also in the elimination of estrogen. So it will become pertaining when we look at the hormonal side. One of my favorite product to address the stress is phosphatidylserine. I find that since we've been talking so much about omega-3s, we kind of forgot that there's other important component of our cell membranes, and phosphatidylserine is one of them. And it's very concentrated in our brain and our cerebral cortex, because that's where it is mostly needed. And there's a phenomenon called synaptic fidelity, and it's like when we have enough phosphatidylserine in our membranes, it increases our sensitivity to the different neurotransmitters. So in other words, we don't need to have a message that is so strong to react. So it improves the communication between our cells. So phosphatidylserine, I really like, especially when women are going through those hormonal variation. I find it gives them a sense of release, and it's like providing a reset button. I really like the phosphatidylserine in perimenopausal women. So it brings down the cortisol level, so it helps with that tired but wired mode at the end of the day. So it helps with the sleep, helps with the memory. You know, oftentimes I hear that as well, that women feel like their memory is not as good as it used to be. So PS 100 is a very good option that you should really try. It resensitizes the cells in the brain. That's what it does, so they better respond to the different neurotransmitters. You could also go with the classic adaptogens. As you know, stress goes in 3 stages: the alarm stage, resistance stage, and exhaustion stage. And different herbs will act at different stages. For example, rhodiola will help you not react so much in the first alarm stage. Ginseng would help really support the resistance stage so that you don't get exhausted so quickly. And herbs such as licorice would help you get out of the exhaustion stage. So we have a very, very nice formula that's very popular at AOR that's called OrthoAdapt. So OrthoAdapt contains all these adaptogenic herbs, and it also contains a very good portion of adrenal extract. So it's 125 milligram of the whole adrenal extract per capsule. And for those of you who are vegan, then we also have the OrthoAdapt Vegan. So it's basically the same formula, but without the adrenal extract. In my experience, when people are really burnt out and exhausted, having that extra support from the adrenal gland will really, really help acting faster and better. But if that's not an option for you, then we do have the vegan formula. The thyroid gland and the adrenal gland are very, very closely related. So when we have exhausted adrenals, very oftentimes the thyroid is affected for a number of reasons. For example, the elevated cortisol hormone will inhibit the transformation from T4 to T3, so thyroid hormones into their active form, and also the stress hormones will use tyrosine as their precursor, and tyrosine is the raw material also to make thyroid hormones. So when adrenal glands are chronically under stress, you'll find that it's important to support the thyroid as well. So a little formula that I like is I recommend 2 of the OrthoAdapt for the adrenals and 1 of the thyroid support. And that's usually a formula that works very well for most women. Again, you have to adapt depending on the biochemical individuality, but that's a good recommendation generally speaking. Again, mood disorders can mimic a lot of the thyroid disorder, mood disorders. So mood and thyroid are very similar. So you have to have proper testing to rule out thyroid issue before you take for granted that the person is only having depression or only having anxiety, because they can really be linked. And in the Myblueprint test, you have testing for 2 of the SNPs or the 2 variations that could impact thyroid health. So thyroid support formula, very complete, very good also to complement if people take, for example, Synthroid. There's absolutely no reason they should not take the thyroid support. The selenium will help them convert that that medication from the T4 to the T3 active form of thyroid hormone. The tyrosine will provide raw material to create the thyroid hormone. So even if people are medicated, yes, they can absolutely combine that with the thyroid support. So overall, how are we going to balance the mood? Well, we have to have a comprehensive look at the person that's in front of us. So again, we're not treating depression or anxiety. We're really addressing an individual who might be experiencing depression and anxiety. So we have to initially look at what's happening from a genetic standpoint, what are the predisposition, the sensitivities. Then we have to make sure we replenish the basic nutrients so we can add protein in the form of advanced whey, B-complex vitamin, advanced B-complex or advanced B-complex ultra, magnesium synergy, or any other form of magnesium we have in the line, vitamin D as needed. Then we have to make sure the gut is in a good state. People don't often know if they don't have chronic diarrhea or constipation. They may not be aware that they have inflammation in the gut or leaky gut. So we have to make sure we address that as well. So different options for probiotics, probiotic 3, advanced biotics, solid fiber for extra fiber. You know, we have to aim at 30, 35 grams of fiber a day. Very hard to do with diet alone. This formula dissolves completely in waters. That's very, very great product. L-glutamine, IBD relief, so different solution for the gut. Then we can balance the neurotransmitters. If once we do all this, the person still experiences some symptoms with 5-HTP or 5-HTP extra, Gaba, xanthionine, saffron, they're all good options. If we need to balance the hormones as well, then we might look into EstroAdapt, thyroid support, again, based also on the genetic predispositions. And for the stress, we have many products that I could have spoke about. Ashwagandha is extremely interesting, rhodiola as well, but my favorite is definitely the PS 100 and OrthoAdapt to support the adrenal. So again, we have to pick and choose based on the symptoms and the situation of the person we have in front of us, but really, really look at a comprehensive approach and don't neglect the small factors like having enough protein, enough magnesium in the diet or in supplements. So these are the supplements covered, and you have all the references at the end. So that closes the webinar for today. Thank you all very, very much for attending.
Thank you so much, Chantal. That presentation was very informative and had lots of really interesting tidbits in there. So I think there was lots to get for our audience. So we received several questions throughout the webinar. What we will do is we won't be able to answer all of them at this time. So we'll create a question and answer log with all the questions we've already received. And if there are any additional questions that you haven't yet gotten in for Chantal or about the AOR products discussed, you can email them to marketing@aor.ca. So that's marketing@aor.ca. We have our next webinar coming up on October 22nd at noon Eastern. Dariana Burbentz will be presenting on a natural approach to optimizing immune system function and health for your pets. So if you're not yet registered for that, you can sign up at aor.ca/webinars. And otherwise, I'd like to thank you again, Chantal, for this awesome presentation. And we will definitely be in touch for answers to any of the questions that have come in.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful evening, everyone.